So I have to start with an observation, which is there are more people in this session than attended any session on this topic between 2000 and 2010 anywhere in North America. So when I started writing about drug laws, I think some of my colleagues thought it was like studying Bigfoot or UFOs or something like it. It was seen as a very obscure topic, but now, of course, there's enormous interest in this, and there's enormous policy action, so this topic couldn't be more timely and important. So we have 4 speakers, and the plan is each speaker is going to talk for 15 minutes, and then we'll call them all up for 15 minutes of questions. And so because of the way the slides are queued up, we're slightly depart from the written order, and I'm going to invite Mauro to start.
So thank you all for being here. My name is Mauro, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. And today I'm going to be talking about whether the presence of marijuana dispensaries in the U.S. affect people's knowledge of medical marijuana laws. And so I'm an epidemiologist by training, and so I always have to say why I'm interested in marijuana. It is the most widely used psychoactive substance in the U.S. aside from alcohol and tobacco, and we see a changing legal status at the state level, but the federal status remains as Schedule 1. And this controversy sort of translates to individual level perceptions of some people thinking of the medical benefits and potential taxation benefits that can arise from marijuana policy, and other people being concerned about safety, individual use, etc. But what we see when we look at national level estimates of public opinion, since 2013, there's been over 50% of people in the U.S. that were polled that reported that they thought that marijuana should be legalized. And we also see that 44% now. 44% now.
I think rather than pointing at the screen, I think you need to point it toward the machine. Oh, yeah.
44% now report lifetime marijuana use in the U.S. And so when we look at national estimates from the National Survey of Drug Use and Health that was referred to this morning, or the NISDA or NISDU or however you want to call it, past year use among U.S. adults is about 13.4% from the latest estimates in 2013. So this is a mandatory map that is already outdated because of today. Pennsylvania just signed, the governor just signed the medical marijuana laws in Pennsylvania. But I'm going to be talking about medical marijuana laws and not the recreational laws for this presentation. And so there's been studies looking at this correlation between medical marijuana and marijuana use at the state level. And so we know from studies, prevalence studies, that the prevalence of marijuana use in states with these MML laws, I'm going to call them MMLs, is higher in states with laws than states without laws. But the studies looking at whether passing these laws actually cause an increase in use indicate that among adolescents there is no causal association. This is a study conducted by Deborah Hassan at Columbia, looking at monitoring nature data from adolescents. And when we look at adult use, which is what I'm going to focus on in this presentation, there seems to be an evidence of increased marijuana use among adults following it. So then we start thinking about why. What are some of the reasons why we see these reasons in adults? And we see that marijuana laws, these medical marijuana laws are not right out of state. And in particular, whether dispensaries change people's knowledge of their medical marijuana status. And these differences could potentially mediate the relationship between these laws and the actual outcome that we're interested in this case, per marijuana use. And so this is kind of the diagram, like billions of these things. And so looking at this potential mediation of correct knowledge between dispensaries and current use. And so if you think about it just in terms of why we would think that dispensaries could change use, just seeing a dispensary might be a cue to you that there is a law in your state, the opening of dispensaries gets a lot of media attention, etc. And so again, in terms of the research question, we were interested in whether dispensaries were associated with the proportion of people in their state who knew that the state allowed medical marijuana, and if so, is this a potential mediator? And so to assess this, we needed a source for the actual policy, so whether the state had a medical marijuana law and whether there were dispensaries open in a particular state in a particular year. We also needed a source for a prevalence estimate of current marijuana use, and also we wanted to incorporate state demographics to account for differences between states in terms of different factors. And so we differentiated medical marijuana laws by whether the state never passed a law, whether it was a state year before they introduced a medical marijuana law or a state year after they introduced the medical marijuana law. And we used enactment year, so not just when the law was passed, but when it was actually enacted, in order to make sure that so for example, if it was passed in like July 1st, but it didn't go into effect January of the next year, we coded as the next year. And for marijuana dispensaries, we used a time-varying variable, so whether they were active dispensaries or not. And this included whether the dispensaries were legally protected or not. So we wanted to look at whether, if the state had a dispensary, is that affected with change in knowledge and corresponding change in use. And so I'm going to be presenting, first of all, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health that we obtained these estimates for included years 2004 to 2013. And this used the restricted use data portal for this national survey. The national survey to look at a nationally representative estimate of people 12 and older and providing state level representative estimates. And the correct MML knowledge, people were asked whether in their state has medical marijuana been legally approved for medical use, and so it was correct if yes, that state year had medical marijuana, and it was also correct if they said no before or there was never an MML. So these are preliminary analyses. This paper we're still conducting analyses before we finalize for publication, but I'll show some data here. So here in the y-axis, we see the proportion of people who said that yes, their state allowed for medical marijuana, and here are the years. And each one of these lines is a state, and so they're dashed before there was an MML enacted and solid after. And so you see here that before an MML was enacted, the proportion saying yes is lower, which is what you would expect, right? So you would expect that after an MML was enacted, the proportion saying yes would be higher. And just descriptively here is what we see for these states that changed status in this 10-year period. But looking at dispensaries, what we see, each one of these little dots is a state year that had medical marijuana. And they are the purple if they don't have a dispensary that state year, and they're green if they did. And so you see that on average, the proportion of people that report that their state had medical marijuana laws, is higher for state years that had dispensaries open than for state years that did not have dispensaries open. But this doesn't tell us whether actually there was a change after they introduced the dispensary. And so what we did was looking at multi-level regression analyses, adjusting for the time period. And so we looked at whether this exposure of MML status and dispensary affected current use, and then looked at this mediation of correct knowledge, adjusting for state demographics. And just to emphasize, these are state level estimates, so it's at the state level are the average proportion of people at the state level. Okay, so these are not individual people in their observation states. So first of all, we just wanted to make sure that in this data set, marijuana dispensaries were associated with current marijuana use, and we did see that for both ages 18 and 25, there was no significant increase after introducing dispensaries, but for adults 26 and older, we do see a significant increase in marijuana use after adjusting for year and state variance. And this main relationship here, we see that for both ages, so all for adults 18 and older, we see a significant increase in correct knowledge of mental status after introducing marijuana dispensaries. And so we see about a 13% increase in the proportion of people that correctly identify their state as having American marijuana law after they've introduced dispensaries, and an 18% increase for adults 26 and older. And both of these are statistically significant. And so then when we put all of these things together in a model, we wanted to see whether after accounting for knowledge, is this relationship still significant? And what we see is that it is no longer significant. The effect of marijuana dispensaries on current marijuana use is no longer significant for adults 26 and older after accounting for this correct variable, while the proportion of people that correctly identify their state as having medical marijuana is still significant with marijuana use. So just to summarize, in terms of our preliminary findings, we see that active dispensaries were associated with higher correct knowledge at the state level, and that this higher knowledge was associated with marijuana use after controlling for whether the state had dispensaries. And that the relationship between dispensaries and marijuana use was no longer significant after we accounted for the proportion of people in that state that correctly identified their mental status. And so when we think about future research, we're interested in assessing whether correct knowledge leads to individual level changes, right? So we're assessing at the state level, looking at the state level proportions, but does that mean that we observe the same kind of thing at the individual level? And so there's some strengths and limitations here. The NISU didn't start capturing whether an individual used marijuana for medical purposes until 2013, so we can assess that beforehand. And there's a potential for reverse causation of marijuana use, so whether it is individuals who use marijuana that also know more about it. So we'll be able to parse that out with individual level data. And there's the potential for self-report bias by legal status, so individuals might be hesitant to report that they use marijuana in a state that it is not legal yet. But nonetheless, these are state representative estimates adjusted for census variables, and we were able to account for the trends over time to isolate this relationship. And so in terms of the big term implications, marijuana use could continue to increase in state active role in that. And so this should be taken into consideration when we're looking at other marijuana-related outcomes. And also more broadly, thinking about when we're assessing the effect of policy interventions, we need to also consider whether we know about these policies and how effective they are. So I want to acknowledge NIDA for funding both the training grant that I'm part of at Columbia University and also the R1 that uses this NISU data. My mentors at Columbia, Sylvia Martins and Joa Hassan, and the collaborators at Columbia.
In the interest of time, we're going to have a question and answer session at the end for all four speakers, and our next speaker will be Evan Cox.
Country. And just kind of a caveat about the paper that I'm about to present, it is not an academic paper. I feel like somewhat of an outlier at this particular conference. We are a civil society organisation, as well as providing free legal services for people who use drugs within the UK. We also advocate for reform of drug laws along the lines of decriminalization.
Next slide view, yeah.
Great, thank you. So this particular paper we released last month. It is an updated 2012 paper of the same name. And in it, we look at over 25 jurisdictions around the world that have implemented some form of decriminalization policy. Note that this is an aggregation of existing research, not our own particular research on this issue. Before kind of getting into particular findings of the paper, it's key to note the definition that we work from, which is actually one that's laid out by Professor Alex Stevens, who's going to present and cater views, which is decriminalization, so removal of criminal sanctions for possession of personal use offences, with the optional imposition of civil penalties, so for example fine or an administrative sanction. Possession is not legal under this model, but there is no criminal record issued. I think that's key to note. There are tremendous variations between the models that we look at. Some are de jure, which means that they're having specific legislative changes to bring about this policy. Some are de facto, where prosecutorial guidance basically states that there should be a deprioritization of policing possession offences. The vast majority of the models that we look at are actually very, very poor. For example, just to pick out two, but not to discriminate against any in particular, Mexico and Russia, somewhat bizarre, have decriminalization policies in place, but they set the threshold so low that a great deal of people are still criminalized for possession offences, even though they are only possessing those particular drugs for their own personal use. Before getting on to the relationship with use levels, I just want to highlight that we also found a number of positive outcomes from decriminalization models when they are implemented effectively. Portugal, I'm not going to go into detail on, because I think it's been done to great lengths, although these are some of the findings from Alex Stevens' and Kate Hughes' work on the health benefits, for example, reduced HIV transmission among people who use drugs after they implemented their model in 2001. Reduced rates of problematic drug use, increased uptake of treatment services within the country. And there are also economic savings that we highlighted in our report. For example, state savings to police and court costs, and societal benefit of South Australia, the Northern Territory, and the Australian Capital Territory, which currently have policies in place. There are variations in thresholds for what is deemed possession of personal use, variation in the fine administrative sanction. Western Australia did have a policy in place from 2004, but they repealed it in 2011. What I hope this table highlights anyway is that if you look at the three highlighted in green and Western Australia, which as I said ended in 2011, all of those rates of use of cannabis for the past 12 months decreased between 1998 and 2007. Indeed, there was a slight increase after that. But importantly, I think this shows, particularly set against other jurisdictions which haven't decriminalized use, is that those models which have liberalized their drug policy didn't bring about increased levels of use. As I said, it's true across all the jurisdictions highlighted on this particular table, and I think basically illustrates in this particular case that you can't attribute use levels to a particular regime or legal regime, which I hope that the following two examples will also illustrate as well. Importantly, research from Australia has also shown that, just kind of diverting from use specifically at the moment, that a comparative analysis of South Australia and Western Australia, this was Western Australia prior to its decriminalisation law in 2004, found that those in Western Australia who were given a criminal record for possession offence suffered negative employment relationship and accommodation consequences, and it increased the likelihood of further contact with the criminal justice system. So it shows that there are potential societal gains to come about from decriminalisation policy that's implemented effectively, not just for the individual, but for society as a whole, because that individual no longer has work prospects taken away from them, and impacts on potential tax revenue for the state, and so on and so forth. Moving on to Portugal, although not on general levels of use among adults, this is focusing on the use of marijuana and hashish among youth in the past 12 months, because an experienced speaker on other panels about the success or otherwise of the Portuguese model, I have come up against a couple of times from people that I will crudely label as anti-reformers. They say, look at the ESTA stats, youth levels of drug use rose. Therefore, Portugal is not a success. I think that's a very crude analysis, to be perfectly honest, because if you look at this, Portugal put the model in place in 2001. Use has gone up slightly compared to that level, but it also went down in 2007. There was no legislative change around that time that brought about the increase in use up until 2011. Indeed, Czech Republic has had a decriminalization policy in place for a number of years, and they put in place thresholds that they defined in 2010. And you can see that use went up, kind of peaking in 2003, and then it's gone down again since. France criminalizes people who use drugs. Bulgaria criminalizes people who use drugs. Both of those rates of use have gone up. So, again, quite simply, you can't attribute rates of use to a particular legal regime. Indeed, one thing I think should be factored in Portugal is the fact that it was one of the economies hardest hit during the downturn. The UNODC has stated in their analysis, not of the country in particular, but more generally, that financial hardship, worries about economic prospects, can increase stress on the family, on the individual, and make them potentially more vulnerable to drug use. I was going to, I've just been in 5 minutes meeting, so I was going to highlight very briefly the Netherlands, just for an example of de facto decriminalization, because I've heard even in other panels today and elsewhere that it's frequently referred to the term legal comes out when speaking about the Netherlands, which I don't think, to my mind, is entirely accurate. Possession and supply is still a criminal offence, but prosecutorial guidance deprioritizes policing of this. Of course, they have the coffee shop model there, and those coffee shops are legally regulated. But studies have found that since 1976, when there was a deprioritization of policing around possession offences, you can't explicitly determine that decriminalisation brought about an increase in use. There was an increase in cannabis use between 1984 and the mid-90s, but that's been attributed to the expansion and commercialisation of coffee shops, not due to the legislative change or policing attitudes towards possession offences specifically. So just for the concluding remarks, I wanted to use a quote from my own government's Home Office, which found in their international comparatives report on drugs in 2014 that they did not observe any obvious relationship between the toughness of the country's enforcement against drug possession and levels of drug use in their country. This was then looking at, among other countries, Japan and Sweden, which have quite harsh regimes of criminalisation in place, and Portugal. And I think this really, hopefully, encapsulates the point that I'm trying to get across in the presentation. Sadly, that doesn't mean anything for the UK. Despite the state this, we still continue to criminalise up to 60,000 people a year, which I believe was the figure last year. Drug use has gone up very slightly in the past year. Drug-related deaths are at an all-time high. But the government will continue to trot out the line that their drug policy is working. Ultimately, I think that there is a tendency to actually over-focus on drug use as an indicator of success, at the expense of realising that there are potential benefits to be drawn from a liberalised model, as I outlined before, be it public health benefits when there is concurrent investment in harm reduction strategies and public health, savings to the state, broader societal benefits through the removal of the hindrance that is a criminal record in persons employed in education opportunities. I mean, indeed, release a guilty, a perpetuating this because we frequently drop out the line to policymakers that we found drug use did not go up under decriminalization. And also, just to be perhaps slightly controversial, I would say that even if under a decrim model, drug use did go up slightly, and it was non-problematic, then so what? If you are having all the other societal benefits and public health benefits brought about from this particular model, people are able to access evidence-informed information on safer drug use and are basically not stigmatized. You know, if you're a problematic drug user, they're not facing the stigma and therefore are able to access harm reduction services and drug treatment services without discrimination, then I would say that that far outweighs the potential uptick in drug use. Thank you.
That's published in Multilevel here. I won't talk too much about the methodology or particulars in terms of data sources that have been discussed, and you can go to the paper as well. One question for people in the room.
On the left, on your slideshow.
Are there any physicians in the audience right now? Any healthcare providers, like clinicians, any kind? A couple. So as far as I can tell from the program, we've got 130, 140 speakers this year, and maybe 6 of us are physicians. And it's interesting because we have 1 million people in the United States, at least 1 million, maybe 1.5 million people participating in what are called medical marijuana programs, but the physicians really have nothing to do with them. Organized medicine has nothing to do with it. None of the medical journals wanted to publish this. We went to a health policy journal, Health Affairs, to publish it. Recently, in a series this morning, one of the speakers pointed out in Colorado, half of the participants in the medical marijuana program in Colorado in 2013 were authorized by 10 doctors. So 10 doctors in Colorado authorized half of the medical participants. The same thing in Oregon. This has been coming up in the news, but the physicians don't want to talk about it. And it's interesting because the media, well, read a New York Mag article, New York Magazine, a couple months ago, and the author, this was the Willie Nelson cover, if you guys saw that, about marijuana. And there was this offhand comment in the text that, you know, there's consensus in the medical community that marijuana is good for patients and should be freely available medically. And I was like, what consensus are you talking about? Because I think this is an important thing to be thinking about and for doctors to be thinking about, because doctors are included in every single one of these 24, now 25, 26 programs in the US. So the physicians rarely have any involvement in crafting the legislation, the program regulations. So this study, which I'll eventually get to, was meant to really be a descriptive analysis of, we're looking at data from 2014 basically. So a descriptive analysis of the 24 programs that had been passed at that point. 19 were in operation, with 24 programs that have been passed as of October 2014. How medical are they? Do they resemble medical care at all, other than requiring an MD or a physician basically to authorize participation? So I'm not going to spend too much time on the background because I think this is familiar to a lot of people, but there's a brief review just thinking along, sort of thinking like about clinical medicine or about the role of healthcare providers in terms of marijuana policy in the US. So there were some symbolic laws, people aren't as familiar, early on that allowed the physicians to prescribe marijuana, but they're called symbolic because you can't prescribe Schedule I substance. More recently, starting in 1996, when modern medical marijuana use from California was the first, of course. These are outdated figures. Evidently, Pennsylvania passed today. Louisiana is quite confusing to me. Louisiana passed something last year, so it's probably more like 26, I think 26. And, you know, I think, and this will come out in our results, but 2009, in a lot of ways, I think was a dividing line in terms of what was happening with medical marijuana programs in the United States. And there are additionally 15, I think this is the most recent number, 15 states with CBD programs. So the requisite map of dark states are familiar with the light green states, mostly in the south, southeast, are the ones with CBD programs, kind of like CBD research programs. So in terms of the medical landscape, this is how it's often portrayed. All right. So what would we want to include if we were to analyze all 24 programs based on how medicalized they are? What would we consider? And it's an interesting thought experiment, and I'm totally open to criticism of what we did. But we came up with a 7-item tool, 7-item checklist, just to look at what the states do or don't include in terms of their regulations that relate to standard clinical practice, standard regulation of pharmaceuticals, current manufacturing practices under the FDA, what would be analogous to those for these purposes, and restrictions on controlled substances. So we're not advocating for any of these things, we're just describing what was happening. We also found very strong associations though with our results, which I'll show you. So the first criterion that we put together was a bona fide documentation relationship. And I think we take this for granted in medicine because we've trained how to do this for years and years, but in general, when a physician sees a patient, you do a full work. Sometimes it's a targeted, like a triage interview, like in the emergency room. If you're a cardiac surgeon, maybe you're just going to work on, working up the heart for a procedure. But in general, when you see a patient, you do a full history and physical, you make a diagnosis, you manage the care, you oversee the treatment, you titrate dosing to outcomes, you rate the risks and benefits. So it seems kind of obvious, but most of so a significant number of the states still don't require this at all. They just ask that the physician authorize the patient's eligibility, more or less. In terms of pharmaceuticals, what we do in the United States, so the FDA approves medications once they've demonstrated efficacy and safety. And of course, we haven't been able to do great research, in part because of the DEA's classification of marijuana as a scheduling substance. But how would this look in a medical marijuana structure? What would be analogous to this? So what we were looking at was, of the 24 programs back in 2014, which of them required state licensed manufacturing and dispensing? Basically as the exclusive route of access. So not allowing home grow, not allowing buying stuff on the illegal market, protections for possession, but which states are setting up the state apparatus for manufacturing and dispensing, also which states require testing and labeling of the products for consistency of dose, make sure it's free of contaminants. Which states have 30-day supplies, like 30-day refills, and whether states allow for smoking or not. Okay, and then 3 more criteria. I'll list these all in a second, but 3 more criteria related to controlled substances. 30-day refill limits, whether the state requires that the physician who's authorizing the patient needs to link to that patient's entries in the prescription drug monitoring program in the state. So all states, this is confusing, but all states basically, one or two, have prescription drug monitoring programs, but initially they arose as a law enforcement technique and they weren't necessarily even available to physicians and pharmacists. New York, for instance, requires that all physicians who are prescribing controlled substances, technically you have to look, there's like an online database, you have to look up the patient before you prescribe them to controlled substance. So we're just looking to see, because that's now standard in a lot of states for controlled substances, we're just looking to see if states require that for their medical marijuana programs. Similarly, and this is less common, but there are some medications where additional training certification waivers are required. Buprenorphine is the most obvious one to think about. And again, we're not necessarily advocating it, we're just looking at the different kinds of restrictions that are common at the state level or the federal level for controlled substances and whether the medical marijuana programs included them. And these 7 different items explained here, and this was the paper. And so you can see it's really a total mix in terms of how states fared. And on average, across all 24 programs, the average was roughly meeting 2 of these criteria. The most commonly met criterion was the bona fide occupation relationship, so almost 2/3 of the states. Very few states had any of the restrictive criteria. So Minnesota and New York require non-smokes. 3, I think Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York require the authorizing physician to link to the PNP, and 3 require physician training. I think it's DC, New York, maybe Connecticut. Very few. So we actually found there's very clear, we didn't even have to do like a cluster analysis or anything fancy, just looking at it, it was very clear that there were 10 programs that met several of the criteria, on average 4, versus 14 of the programs where you really just couldn't think of them as being medical in any way. So maybe 8 of them, or 14, had a score of 1 for the bona fide occupational relationship, but other than that, they didn't meet any they just had no program elements that were similar to how medicine is practiced or how pharmaceuticals are distributed in the country. So if you do a group analysis by the medicalized programs versus non-medical programs, you can see there's big differences in terms of this. So the medicalized programs mostly passed since 2009 by legislatures, whereas the early programs were more non-medical out west. And these are, the non-medical states are less dense, slightly lower GDPs in 2014. Newer enrollment rates came out, sort of 18-month update to these figures, and all of this stands up. I think now it's like 98.2% so of participants are in the non-medical programs. And I'm happy to talk more about Europe in the Q&A to play out of time. But I also want to thank co-authors, some of whom are in the room, the team effort. So, and we're doing further analyses to look at, especially over time, getting into the nuance, especially with the more restrictive criteria that seems to affect its population level outcomes, starting with enrollment rates, but also looking at social costs.
The reason I was so curious about it was because of the finding they reported. We've heard previously from speakers here, in this session and elsewhere, that it's not been found in previous studies that countries that have more liberal policies have higher rates of cannabis use. And this goes back perhaps to Joggle heresies even back then. But we've had work from Craig Reinemann, Louise Degenhardt, the work that Release have done, work that I've done tends to suggest, the work that Home Office has done in the UK tends to suggest that there isn't necessarily an association between a liberalisation of policy and a higher rate of use. So to have this finding come out was quite intriguing. So they stated that countries which had liberalisation tended to have higher rates of use amongst their adolescents, even when controlling the characteristics of those countries and those adolescents, but a slightly lower effect on boys than girls. And that's a really interesting finding. And by happenstance, I happened to have the same data that they based their analysis on in my computer at the time. So I thought, well, let's have a look at this. So in today's talk, I'm going to be talking about this data upon which this finding is based. I'm going to be talking about specific issues in the comparison between countries, which are relevant not just to this paper, but to the entire point of this conference. I'm going to show you the results of the Xie et al. Paper. I'll describe their paper as Xie et al. From now on, that's right. And I'm going to show you how I hope I've improved their the analysis of that data, and what the results of that reanalysis mean for our attempts to understand policy and the research that we need to carry out around the effects of policy on cannabis use. The data comes from the Health Behaviour in School-Aged Children survey, which is a World Health Organization sponsored survey of about 170,000 adolescents across 38 different countries. It's carried out at the ages of around 15. It's a school-based survey. It's a cluster randomized paper and pen questionnaire handed out to adolescents who are asked about their use of substances and a wide variety of other health behaviours. We have data from 3 waves of this survey, from 2001 and 2, 2006, 2009 and 10, and Xie et al. Put all the data from all these 3 waves into the same data set for analysis. Okay. Let's look at what the raw, what they did for the country comparison. If you want to look at the effects of policy on use, then you need to have some way of classifying the countries. And this is based on their table that they gave of which countries liberalised their policies and when. And so you'll see that for each country's got 3 columns, 1 at each different time point. And the 0 means that they hadn't liberalised, and the 1 means that they had. Now this is problematic to start with, because we know that it's not just a question of yes or no when you liberalise. But they used the classifications from Robin Room and other colleagues' work in the Beyond Stalemate report to try and work out what liberalisation is and what it looks like. And also information on those countries to see when they did it. So you see there's some countries like Austria at the top, always liberalised across these time periods, whereas Bulgaria had never liberalised, whereas other countries actually did liberalise during these time points. And so similar to Pia's paper earlier, we're talking about country years as being liberalised rather than countries. You'll also see some problematic countries here. We heard about the difference from Russia, for example. Russia, de jure, is decriminalized, but as Ed was saying, the amounts are very tiny. And so to classify it alongside Spain, which has long had a much more liberal approach to the amount of cannabis you can have on you without being criminalized, is quite difficult. And then you've got the problematic example of the United States, which is problematic for an even more complicated reason, which is that you've got huge heterogeneity within the country. It's not only the United States that has heterogeneity within the country. My country is made up of 4 countries, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England, each of which has a different approach. So it's very difficult to do this. But I'm just basing it on what she et al. Did. And if you compare the countries in the years, just look at the average rate that children report using cannabis, this is what you get. 13% reporting past-year use in those countries which have full prohibition, compared to that 18.4% in countries which have some liberalisation. And for purposes of our analysis I'm going to show you, this can also be described as an odds ratio. So you take the comparison group, which is countries which have full prohibition, compare it to the countries which have some liberalisation. The odds in those countries are 1.47 times higher that child will report having used cannabis. But the problem with this is just a raw comparison. We're not taking into account things like the characteristics of the countries, such as how wealthy those countries are, which might affect whether people are using cannabis, as well as their policy. And also we're not taking into account the individual characteristics of the children in those countries. So if there's different family structures, or people spend different time with their peers, or they have different sort of psychological problems, then we might expect different rates, and that would confuse the picture. So we need to take account of that, and she et al. Did take account of that in their model. What they didn't take account of was the things below this line, which I'm now going to grey out, because she et al. Didn't take into account things like these country codings, the within country effects, the fact that these are adult policies that they're coding on, but actually we're talking about adolescents' use, the fact that we've got possible heterogeneity, that it might be high cannabis use leads to liberalisation rather than the other way around, and the fact that we've got problems in levels of analysis. And the ecological fallacy might apply. The ecological fallacy, I hope, is reduced by the fact that we're using a multi-level model here. So we're doing a multi-level linguistic regression, which takes into account simultaneously the effects of the individual and the country level characteristics. And we have the results from she et al. Here with 3 columns for lifetime use, past year use, and regular use, which is having ever used more than 40 times. And there's a lot going on in this model, and so I'll try and focus your attention on the interesting bits for this talk, which is the policy effect. And you see there's 2 lines for the policy effect. One is the main effect of the liberalisation, and that shows indeed an odds ratio above 1, so one expects that means that it's more towards a higher. But we also have the interaction effect of the liberalisation times being a boy. And so she et al. Do report that it's weaker for boys, but actually if you do this correctly, you have to multiply, to get what happens to the effect for boys, you have to multiply the main effect by the interaction effect. And as Ollie Ruggerberg, who might be in the room, even said hi, pointed out, if you multiply those 2 together, it actually seems that boys are less likely in liberalised countries to report using cannabis, which is interesting in itself. So that intrigued me even further, so I went to the data and looked at what we could do with the data. I found there was more data than available in the data set than she et al. Used. I found also that they had controlled for, in their multi-level model, the fact that the countries would have different rates amongst themselves, but they hadn't controlled for the fact there might be a different relationship between use and gender across different countries. They had assumed that the relationship between use and gender was the same across all countries. And the further model I ran found that is not the case. The model fits better if you include the random effect of gender across countries. So we can improve the model by including more of the data and by including the random effect of gender across countries. And if you do so, you get these results. And then again, the line to look at here is whether there's a significance in the main effect, or even whether you multiply the effects together, you get anything, either for boys or girls, and it seems that you don't. So if we actually do these adjustments correctly, we come to a graph that looks like this, which is, if anything, the maths are suggesting that the odds of use are lower in liberalised countries, even though that effect is not significant. So we get a finding from the same data that Sheartown used to say that we've got, finally, a finding that says that use is higher in liberalised countries. But actually, if you do, I think, a better model using more of the data that has a better model fit than the one they used, you find that this data set supports all those other studies which have found that there isn't necessarily an effect of cannabis liberalisation on cannabis use at the cross-sectional level, of whatever that means in terms of policy analysis. One thing it means is that if we don't have this evidence that policy inflicting the harms of cannabis criminalisation has an effect. So let's break that down. The harms of cannabis criminalisation are some things that Ed mentioned. They're the harms that we do to people, not just by punishing them. Obviously, punishment is the deliberate infliction of a harm, but we also put laying on them the stigmatisation of a criminal record, which has been shown in many studies to be harmful in the long term, perhaps more harmful than the immediate punishment of the person. It's also costly. We're spending a lot of money in our criminal justice systems doing this, so we're harming ourselves as well. And the justification often given for that is this is necessary because if we didn't do it, there would be more harms from adolescent cannabis use. But the more we look, the less evidence we find for that proposition. And it seems to me, as Simon Lenson said in 2001, the burden of proof should be upon those who want to inflict cost and harm to show that there's an effect. And they have not yet been able to show that effect in cross-national studies. I'm going to finish probably just by leaving this up here, because this is a list of all the different things we'd have to do, and there are many of them, to improve our understanding of the effects of different policies on cannabis use. We'd have to look longitudinally, not just cross-sectionally. We'd have to have better theories, as the point Alison Ritter, my predecessor, was the president of ISFPP, has said. We just don't have very good theories about how cannabis policy affects cannabis use. Don Desjardins made exactly the same point when thinking about why cocaine use has gone down and marijuana use has gone up in the US. We still don't have theories really that explain that. We need to be looking more at data, getting better comparability in data at different ages. So, for example, we know that the correlates of cannabis use are different at 14 than they are at 16. And this group is somewhere in the middle of that. So it might be even more different for adults. So we can't just generalise from 15-year-olds to everybody else in the population about what sort of effects are being had in policies.